For over 3,300 years, ancient Egypt buried a secret so dangerous that they painted over history itself. Hieroglyphics were deliberately erased, records were destroyed, and one of the most powerful women in history was systematically erased from existence. But recently, using advanced technology and ground-penetrating radar, researchers have uncovered the truth hidden beneath layers of paint and stone. And what they found suggests that Egypt's ruling class went to extraordinary lengths to hide not just where Nefertiti died, but how she died, and what she discovered about power. This is the story of a cover-up that lasted more than 3 millennia, a conspiracy that involved the highest levels of Egyptian government, the priesthood, and the military. This is the story of how history was rewritten to erase a woman whose influence was so profound that her very existence became a threat to those who succeeded her. And this is the story of how modern science is finally bringing the truth back into the light. Her name was Nefertiti, which translates to, "The beautiful woman has arrived." She was born around 1370 BC into the family of A, one of Egypt's most influential viziers. From her earliest days, Nefertiti was groomed for greatness. She was educated far beyond what was typical for women of her time. She learned hieroglyphics, statecraft, theology, and the art of diplomacy. She understood power in ways that most men would never comprehend. Her father, A, was determined that his daughter would marry well, and by well, he meant he would marry into the royal line. At just 15 years old, Nefertiti married Amenhotep IV, who would later become known as Akhenaten, one of ancient Egypt's most revolutionary and controversial rulers. When Nefertiti first entered the royal palace, Egypt was at the height of its prosperity. The treasuries were overflowing with gold and tributes from conquered lands. The priests of Amun held enormous power, controlling vast estates and wealth that sometimes rivaled the pharaoh himself. The temples were ornate beyond imagination, built with the finest materials and decorated with incredible artistry. The people worshipped multiple gods, and the religious establishment maintained their grip on society through centuries-old traditions and rituals that had remained unchanged for hundreds of years. This was the world that Nefertiti inherited when she became the great royal wife. But this world was about to change in ways that nobody could have predicted. The changes would be so dramatic, so revolutionary, that they would fundamentally reshape Egyptian civilization. And at the center of this transformation would be a 15-year-old girl who would become one of history's most influential and most suppressed figures. Akhenaten was not a typical pharaoh. From the moment he ascended to the throne, he began to question everything. He rejected the old ways. He looked at the pantheon of Egyptian gods and sought not divine truth, but political manipulation. The priests had become too powerful, he believed. The tradition had become too stagnant. Something needed to change, and Akhenaten was determined to be the one to change it. But he did not do this alone. Standing beside him, whispering counsel, offering support, was his young wife Nefertiti. Together, they would attempt to revolutionize Egyptian civilization, and in doing so, they would make enemies that would never forgive them. Nefertiti introduced her husband to a radical new theology. She proposed something that had never been attempted in Egypt before: monotheism. Instead of worshipping multiple gods, they would worship a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk itself. This was not just a religious shift. This was a fundamental transformation of Egyptian society. It stripped power away from the priests of Amun, who had accumulated centuries of influence and wealth. It centralized religious authority in the hands of the pharaoh and, by extension, his wife. It eliminated the need for the massive priestly hierarchy that had grown so powerful that they could rival the throne itself. It was revolutionary. It was dangerous. And it would have consequences that would echo through the centuries and beyond. The priests of Amun were not going to accept this quietly. The old nobility was not going to accept this without resistance. But Nefertiti and Akhenaten were prepared to face that resistance, and they had the power to enforce their vision. Akhenaten began to change everything. He abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes, with its powerful priesthood and ancient traditions, and built an entirely new city called Akhetaten, which means the horizon of Aten. He moved the court, the government, the religious center of Egypt, all to this new location. He ordered temples built to the Aten. He commissioned artists to depict him and Nefertiti in entirely new ways, showing them as human, as loving parents, as partners in divinity, rather than the distant, godlike figures of previous pharaohs. He was breaking every rule that Egypt had ever known, and Nefertiti was not merely a passive participant in this revolution. She was an active architect of it. The historical records show her growing in size in artistic depictions across temples and monuments. Early in their reign, she is portrayed as smaller than her husband, as is traditional for queens. But as time goes on, she becomes larger and larger until she stands at equal height to Akhenaten himself. In some depictions, she is even shown to be larger. This was not mere artistic whimsy or the preference of individual artists. This was a deliberate, coordinated statement about her power and influence that was enforced across the kingdom. She was a co-ruler in every sense of the word. Contemporary inscriptions called her by titles that had never before been applied to a queen in Egyptian history. She was the god's wife. She was the beloved of the king. She was the lady of all women. She was portrayed alongside her husband, performing religious rituals that only pharaohs had traditionally performed, sometimes even taking the leading role in these sacred ceremonies. She wore the royal regalia. She held the religious symbols of authority. She was, in every way that mattered, a pharaoh herself. The people of Egypt were confused and, in many cases, deeply disturbed by these changes. The old religions provided comfort and structure. Families had worshipped specific gods for generations. The priestly class that benefited from the traditional system was horrified. But Nefertiti and Akhenaten were not concerned with the comfort of the masses or the wounded pride of the priests. They had a vision of a new Egypt, and they were determined to create it. During these years, Egypt was also experiencing practical problems. The empire was losing territories in Asia to the Hittites. The military was neglected because Akhenaten had no interest in warfare or conquest. The gold tributes that had once flowed into Egyptian treasuries began to diminish. The economy, despite the visible wealth, was beginning to strain under the weight of Akhenaten's ambitious building projects and his abandonment of traditional military endeavors. Yet for a time, Nefertiti had everything. She had given Akhenaten 6 daughters, which was remarkable fertility and demonstrated the gods' favor upon their union. 2 of these daughters would go on to become queens themselves. She was depicted in art as a stunning beauty with high cheekbones, a long swan-like neck, and an elegance that captivated artists and sculptors. Her famous bust, discovered in 1912 by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchert in an artist's workshop in Amarna, would become the most iconic symbol of ancient Egypt, recognized around the world as the epitome of beauty and power. During the early years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti seemed untouchable. She had achieved everything a woman could achieve in ancient Egypt. She had influence over a god-king. She had power that rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. She had security, wealth, and historical significance. But then something changed. The records become unclear around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign. This is where history becomes murky, where the details become contradictory, and where, many scholars now believe, the cover-up began. Shortly after this point in time, one of Nefertiti's daughters died. The records show that Akhenaten, one of her youngest daughters, died in childbirth at just 13 years old. The walls of their tombs still show the artistic depictions of Akhenaten and Nefertiti mourning over their daughter's body. It was an unprecedented tragedy, made even more tragic by the daughter's extreme youth and the fact that she had been married off, as was custom, to produce an heir. After this tragedy, something shifted. 3 other daughters simply disappeared from the historical record. And then, most significantly, Nefertiti herself vanished. She was no longer mentioned in official documents. She no longer appeared in public inscriptions. She no longer was depicted in art. It was as if she had been erased. It was as if she had never existed. For centuries, Egyptologists have debated what happened to her. The simplest explanation was that she died, as the Britannica Encyclopedia now states. But there was no record of her death. There was no tomb found containing her body. There was no mummified remains, no funerary goods, no evidence that she had been properly buried according to Egyptian customs. This was deeply unusual. Queens of her status were always given elaborate burials. They were always carefully mummified and placed in tombs filled with treasures and religious texts to guide them to the afterlife. The complete absence of such evidence raised questions. Where was Nefertiti's body? What happened to her? Why was she erased from history? Another theory emerged over the decades. Some scholars proposed that Nefertiti did not die at all. Instead, they suggested that she went into hiding or was banished by her husband. Others argued that she actually became the co-regent, ruling alongside Akhenaten under a different name. Some historians believe that after Akhenaten's death, she actually ruled Egypt as a pharaoh in her own right, possibly under the name Neferneferuaten. If this is true, then she may have been the female king who succeeded her husband before handing the throne to the young boy who would become Tutankhamun. This theory is becoming increasingly accepted among modern scholars, but it remains controversial because the historical evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. What is known is that after Akhenaten's death in the 17th year of his reign, Egypt underwent a dramatic reversal. The Aten was abandoned, the old gods were restored, Thebes was re-established as the capital. The priesthood of Amun, which had been stripped of power during the Akhenaten years, reclaimed their authority and their wealth. Someone made the decision to systematically erase Akhenaten's legacy. His name was chiseled off monuments, his temples were torn down or repurposed. His very memory was condemned to oblivion in what Egyptologists call damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory. This was an act of deliberate historical erasure orchestrated by powerful forces within Egyptian society. Nefertiti's disappearance occurred within this larger context of erasure and reversal. But here is where the story becomes particularly intriguing and where recent discoveries have begun to shed light on what really happened. For decades, researchers had assumed that Nefertiti was buried somewhere in Amarna, the city she and Akhenaten had built. Archaeological excavations of the Amarna royal tomb revealed no evidence of her presence. But in 2015, a researcher named Nicholas Reeves, who is widely considered one of the world's foremost Egyptologists and a former curator at the British Museum, proposed a radical theory. What if Nefertiti was not buried in Amarna at all? What if she was buried somewhere else entirely? What if she was buried in the Valley of the Kings in the very tomb of Tutankhamun, the young boy king who came after her? This theory seemed far-fetched at first. Tutankhamun's tomb had been discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter and had been studied exhaustively for over a century. Surely, if there were a hidden chamber containing Nefertiti, someone would have found it by now. But Reeves was not working with conventional archaeological methods. He was using high-resolution imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced analysis of the tomb's architecture and art. What he discovered was astonishing. Hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster, deliberately covered over and concealed, were hieroglyphics that told an entirely different story than what Egypt's official records had long maintained. These hieroglyphics depicted cartouches, the oval hieroglyphic seals that represented the names of Egyptian monarchs. But these cartouches were unusual. They showed not I burying Tutankhamun, as the official version of history claimed, but rather they showed Tutankhamun burying Nefertiti. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Tutankhamun was burying Nefertiti, that meant Nefertiti outlived the young king. It meant she was still alive and in power after his death. It meant her body was brought to his tomb for burial, possibly in a secret chamber adjacent to his own burial vault. But then, whoever succeeded Tutankhamun, whoever held power after him, had deliberately painted over these hieroglyphics. They had hidden the evidence. They had rewritten history. They had attempted to erase her. The question became why? What was so threatening about Nefertiti that even after her death, Egypt's rulers went to such lengths to conceal her memory? Now imagine Nefertiti in this scenario. She was in her 40s, still charismatic, still possessed of the knowledge and connections that came from having ruled alongside Akhenaten. She was a threat to the new regime precisely because she understood the full complexity of governance in a way that the boy king could not. She knew where the power centers were. She understood the economy, the priesthood, the military structure. She had supporters, people who were loyal to her and to the vision she and Akhenaten had shared. From the perspective of the new regime, she represented a dangerous link to the past, a living reminder of the revolution that they had just undone. Eliminating her, whether through natural means or otherwise, would have been strategically beneficial. The evidence of hieroglyphics being painted over suggests that someone wanted to hide the connection between Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. They wanted to hide the fact that she was the one who orchestrated his burial rites, the one who maintained power after his death. By concealing these hieroglyphics, they were attempting to create a false historical narrative where Nefertiti never mattered, never wielded the power she actually wielded, and certainly never outlived the young king. This was psychological erasure. This was an attempt to remove her from history itself. Recent advances in technology have given us tools that the ancient Egyptians never imagined would exist. Ground-penetrating radar can now see through stone walls without disturbing them. DNA analysis can identify remains with extraordinary precision. Thermal imaging can detect heat signatures from hidden chambers. These technologies have allowed archaeologists to peer into places that have been sealed for thousands of years, and what they are finding is beginning to tell a very different story than what the official historical record has long claimed. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, researchers have discovered evidence of multiple phases of construction and renovation. The tomb appears to have been built for someone larger than Tutankhamun, someone of greater status and power. The walls show signs of having been altered and redecorated after the initial burial. The hieroglyphics show signs of deliberate alteration, with newer inscriptions painted over older ones. All of this evidence points toward a deliberate cover-up, a conscious effort to conceal the truth about who was buried where and what the original purpose of the tomb had been. Some researchers have now proposed an even more radical theory. What if Tutankhamun's tomb was originally built for Nefertiti? What if Nefertiti died and was placed in this tomb, and after Tutankhamun's death, his body was hastily added to the same tomb as a way of creating a veneer of legitimacy? What if the entire complex was reorganized to obscure this truth? This theory remains speculative, but it would explain many of the architectural anomalies that have puzzled archaeologists for decades. The question of how Nefertiti died remains largely unanswered, but various theories have emerged based on the fragmentary evidence we possess. Some scholars have proposed that she died of a plague. In her later years, Egypt was experiencing a general social and economic decline. Diseases could have swept through the population. But there is no specific evidence supporting this theory. Others have suggested that she died of grief, particularly after losing her young daughter in such tragic circumstances. Grief can certainly contribute to illness and death, but this is an emotionally driven explanation rather than one based on hard evidence. What we do know is that around the 16th year of Akhenaten's reign, an inscription was discovered carved into a rock face in an ancient quarry 10 kilometers north of Amarna. This inscription dates to late in Akhenaten's reign, and specifically mentions Nefertiti's name and her title as Great Royal Wife. This suggests that she was still alive and still held her position at that time, but we do not know exactly when she died. We do not know the specific cause. We do not know whether her death was natural or hastened by other means. We do not know whether she went willingly to her tomb or whether her body was placed there by others. All of this remains mysterious, hidden beneath the layers of cover-up that Egypt's ancient rulers deliberately constructed. The good news is that modern science is beginning to reverse this ancient cover-up. Every new technological advancement brings researchers closer to the truth. The DNA analysis that Hawass promised might finally reveal the identity of the mummies in those Valley of the Kings tombs. The ground-penetrating radar might reveal hidden chambers that have been sealed for millennia. The advanced imaging of hieroglyphics might bring to light other inscriptions that have been deliberately concealed. The revolution that Nefertiti and Akhenaten tried to accomplish was ultimately reversed by the forces that opposed it. But the history of that revolution, the truth about Nefertiti's power and influence, is slowly being restored. What happened to Nefertiti may never be completely known. We may never have absolute certainty about the exact cause of her death or the precise circumstances of her burial. But what is becoming increasingly clear is that she was far more important to ancient Egyptian history than the official historical record has suggested. She was not merely a beautiful queen. She was not merely a supportive wife. She was a revolutionary figure in her own right, a powerful political operator who shaped the course of an entire civilization. And when she represented a threat to the new order, she was systematically erased from history. Her story is a cautionary tale about the power of those in charge to rewrite history, to erase evidence, to construct false narratives that suit their political interests. It is also a story of hope, because despite the best efforts of Egypt's ancient rulers to eliminate her memory, Nefertiti has not been forgotten. Her famous bust is one of the most recognized artifacts from ancient Egypt. Her name is spoken in hushed tones of reverence and wonder. Her life continues to captivate archaeologists and historians and the public imagination. As the research continues, as technology advances, as more hieroglyphics are decoded and more tombs are examined, we will likely learn more about what really happened to Queen Nefertiti. We will discover whether the mummies in the Valley of the Kings include her remains. We will perhaps learn the true cause of her death. We will come to understand the full extent of the cover-up that was perpetrated against her memory. And in doing so, we will restore to history one of its most remarkable and most suppressed figures. The truth, it seems, cannot remain buried forever, not even in ancient Egypt.